podcast where we put you on the map. This is Ron Costa broadcasting live in the Mappable USA studios in Las Vegas, Nevada. And folks, you guys got businesses out there. You want to increase the equity, maybe the value of it, maybe? You may want to stick around for this podcast because that's what we're going to be talking about. But before we get into that, let's introduce Vicky Hutchmala from the World Token Market. Vicky, how are you doing today?
Doing fabulous, Ron, just like always, except in Vegas we're having a little bit of wind, a little bit difficult doing my walk this morning. I kept getting blown across the street, but otherwise, pretty good. And we have a great podcast.
I think that might be the reason why I can't see through my window right now with all the wind here in the studios. It's crazy. It's like I don't even have a mirror. The windows aren't working right now. But we don't care because we got a great podcast. So let's get this going. Let's introduce Howard Lim. He's the CEO of How Creative. He's been on the show before. Howard, how you doing today?
Doing fantastic. Not dealing with the high winds like you, though.
Well, listen, you deal with the great weather the other 364 days of the year, right?
Yeah, it's pretty nice.
Yeah, it's pretty nice. But you're out in California, right, Howard?
Correct.
Yeah. It's you can't beat the weather over there for sure. But again, like we said earlier, you've been on the podcast before. We had a great episode. We talked about building the brand last time, and it went really, really well. So before we get into the next topic on this podcast, maybe we could just go over your background again real quickly.
Sure. Yeah, so a little bit about my background. I've been doing this for 35 years. My business evolves every year, but started off with design and advertising and then helped with the digital age, leading that, where things were now digitized on a computer, using the computer, and then led the road, you could say, with modern branding. And now what we do is we design companies from the inside out and outside in.
Well, exactly, that's good. And then the last time, again, we kind of left it off at the branding thing. Let's say somebody, I know this isn't an overnight process because branding takes a long time, but let's say now we followed your advice from the previous podcast, and now we've got our own business, and we've got this going on, and now we want to talk about growing it in terms of its value and its equity. So maybe we could start along those lines. What do you got to do? What's the next step in that process?
So the next step after you actually have a brand that actually is defined on what you do, what you stand for, and how do you differentiate, and then building the identity, meaning like the name, the tagline, the look and the feel through its website, let's say storefront if you have a store, packaging, product design. So there's basically is building a continuity between every quote-unquote what they call in the branding world a touch point. A touch point is everything that interface between you and your customer of your product or service or information. Again, like a website, it could be a billboard, it could be an advertising spot or marketing. And when it comes to then how do you actually grab more market share or become what I call instant recall, be more memorable in the minds or heart of your customers, that's when we start looking at how do you actually build the actual equity and the value of your company. So to back up, the difference between brand equity and brand value is brand equity is when you actually have a set of assets that are linked to and associated to your company's image or name. So if I say, let's say Nike, pretty much everybody that's listening to me right now understands what industry they're in, which is the apparel industry, and then what category, which, is athletic. And the reason why people understand what category, what industry they're in is through a set of assets that have built them to be recognized in that specific industry and category. through advertising, design, and marketing. And so if it's done right, you want to have it where you're actually then building, quote unquote, a story of these assets that become familiar with the consumer, such as the tagline, "Just Do It." That becomes a huge asset for Nike because it separates them from everybody else, and it becomes memorable, and it creates a trigger in the mind of the consumer saying, "Oh, that's Nike. I know what they stand for, and I know what differentiates them versus other products in the space, being high quality. Any athlete, all the famous athletes, use Nike products. It's like, why aren't you using a Nike product? Hence the campaign, "Just Do It." You have no excuse. So brand assets is really, again, a set of assets that helped distinguish you from other companies, and it builds value to the bottom line. And that's what leads into what I call brand value, and others do too in the professional world of branding. Brand value is now, what's the company worth now, and what is its future potential earnings based on its assets. So equity is based on a set of assets associated with the company that actually creates recall in the consumer's mind and what they stand for. And the best way, by the way, to build these assets is to protect your intellectual property by building trademarks, by, let's say, trademarking. Also, colors make a huge difference. So Tiffany, for example, they own that robin color of blue, and
right.
And let's say Barbie pink, they own that pink, that Pantone color. Those are all assets that create that instant recall in the consumer's mind.
Oh, well, sometimes branding and marketing and that business owners, sometimes they have to really focus in on who actually is their customer, their end user, and create that emotional connection to them. But then they have to understand who they are, why they are, where they are, and then figure out a strategy of how to reach them so that they can build up their equity and their assets in their business.
Yeah,
would you agree?
That brings up a good point, and that's different between marketing and branding. Branding is what the company wants to stand for, and then using the tools of the identity, and then marketing is promoting that tool, promoting that identity. Okay, so you're exactly right. Is identifying the market and the segment of market through market research, and then it's about utilizing the brand of what that company stands for, and promoting what that company stands for through an array of different channels, whether online and offline. Meaning, is it going to be print, or is it going to be digital media, or social media, or what have you? But you're exactly right. Is identifying your target market and then promoting it, and then making sure that you have the brand assets to be affiliated with that brand to make it easier for the customer to remember who you are.
And also, you don't want your product or your brand necessarily to become stagnant. That everybody knows what a Kleenex is, even though that's branding. But you need it to evolve and become bigger and better, so that emotional connection grows as well to reinforce what you're doing, right?
Yeah, there's a part where the philosophy and the vision, the value should always remain the same. But what you're referring to is the marketing shifts based on the different buying powers. Like, we got the baby boomers, and we got the X, and we got the Y, which people refer to as millennials. And then we got the Z generation now coming out, which starts at 25 years of age. The point being is, yes, you shift your marketing campaigning based on the psychographics of who you want to appeal to. And so baby boomers are different the way that their approach versus, let's say, millennials. And also what media channels you want to use, print versus digital, for example, or let's say, radio versus the web. So yes, you do want to be current on understanding the customer's persona and understanding what media to use, but the vision, the philosophy, and the values of the company should not shift. And when they do, that's where companies get into trouble.
Right, because they lose their initial vision of what it is that they're trying to do, or what service they're trying to provide, or what product they're manufacturing. Whatever it is, you have to keep that initial vision and just change your strategy as you go forward.
Yeah, change your market strategy, but yes, you got to keep what you stand for always clear. And if you change what you stand for, the overall positioning, then it alters your loyalty, customer loyalty.
Absolutely. And within your company too, you everything is relative inside a company. Before you even get to the branding, you have to create a strategy that incorporates who your customer is, who your end user is, have an effective team and efficient procedures, but also have leadership empathy so that everything works kind of simultaneously, and you create a synergy that makes you successful.
Yeah, exactly. That's why we've moved to now designing companies from the inside out. But you're exactly right. It has to start with the culture you want to create, and that culture definitely impacts the overall business value as well. So the culture that you want to create has to do with the leadership and being able to have your culture adhere to those values, but also just to attract the right employees. Like there's so many issues right now that I'm hearing where companies, one of the biggest problems right now is companies getting employees. There's plenty of work opportunities, right? And there's plenty of positions that are available. It's just what's happening now is that you got the millennials that, again, think differently than the baby boomers, but the companies that have the baby boomers mentality in a sense of what kind of culture they want to create, they're not attracting the next workforce, actually the current workforce, I should say,
right,
which is the millennials. And that's where companies are running into problems because they're not clear of their culture. And with the millennials, they really want to attach themselves to a culture that, quote unquote, is cause-driven in their minds.
Right, yeah. and your employees and whoever is on your team helping you, they have to buy into your vision and your purpose and your branding and everything so that they can be effective. You can't have scattered people all working, so in different directions, because it's not going to work. It'll fall apart.
Yeah, and that's what's happening faster and faster, especially, unfortunately, during COVID. That was the real test of companies' strengths. Not just their business model, of course, retail, restaurants, hospitality got hit pretty hard. But even then, the companies that had a clear philosophy and were clear on its directions and purpose, whether a restaurant or not, a lot of them actually did pretty darn well because they stayed clear to what they stood for, regardless of what they sold. And those ones really prosper. Unfortunately, a lot of companies weren't clear of their philosophy, their values. So, yes, they fell apart. Or, exactly what you're saying, too, is that a lot of companies weren't clear of their purpose, and so they got pulled in 1,000 different directions and fell apart.
Right. There's a difference between changing your company or your product or your branding and just adapting to what is going on around you to make sure that everybody's still on the same page. Adapting and changing are totally different things.
Yeah, exactly right. And so, one of the things that I love working on and getting hired quite a bit is to work on business models that are more relevant. Every time there's a crisis there's always opportunity, big opportunity. And unfortunately, companies get in their own way by not seeing that because they're looking through what they've always done.
Yeah. And that leads to a question of mine I wanted to ask earlier when you were talking about assets, Howard, about are people assets, specifically, let's say, spokespeople? Like, for example, Tiger Woods puts on a Nike hat, and that does wonders for the company, right? So what do you think about something like that?
That is part of building a brand equity, by the way, is when I say brand equity, it does mean quite a few different things, right? But one of them is brand association. So a lot of people, which is great, a lot of companies use celebrities to be associated with a particular spokesperson or celebrity themselves, or let's say influencer or leader. There's different ways of looking at this, right? The point being is that it does help the company's position as long as who they're choosing to be associated with them doesn't do something immoral or something unjust that actually works against the brand's own philosophy. And that could actually, hinder a brand too. So it kind of gets kind of dicey nowadays.
It does. That was my next point. Well, everybody loves Tiger Woods until he drives his car off the road, and then all of a sudden, nobody wants to be associated with him, and now he's back, and it's just really weird how that cycle happens. And also, what do you do about a brand that maybe, I don't know, they shift what they mean? I don't want to get too political, but something like Disney, for example, they're taking a lot of hits these days. What is, the same thing. What do they do in that situation?
Well, it becomes really difficult because, it's an American-made company, but yet they're getting outside support because we're living in a global economy to remain competitive. So they have to think differently, quite honestly. They have to think of what they could do that actually keeps true to their philosophy as far as American dream, being built in America, right? So there's different ways that they need to think differently as how they actually obtain their goods. And even though sometimes it means like if it was raising a price point, it's based on the people that actually are celebrating with Disney. Are they wanting a piece of that? It's kind of like Levi's. Levi's were really huge in the 70s. They're still, of course they're still big, but you got a lot of big competitors. But the 70s and 80s, Levi's were really the monopoly, quote unquote. And the reason for that is because the Russians, during the whole thing with the Cold War and all that stuff, right? People were paying up to $100, $200, just as back in the 80s, right? That were paying $100 or $200 for a pair of jeans because they wanted something that was made in America. So you got to, it's again rethinking the business model. What's the opportunity and why are people upset? And if you lose too many people that are upset based on you're going against and being a hypocrite against your own philosophy, that could be counterproductive as far as building your brand equity and the value, by the way.
Right. Well, if I can make a confession, I still have my members-only jacket from way back then. It's there somewhere in the house.
Those were a big deal. I remember that back in the 80s.
Yeah.
And everything old comes around.
So it might be like Disney then. Oh, go ahead.
No, go on. Finish your thought. I want to move to another topic.
So I was just thinking like Disney, it might be that they pop up with some other product or service that really does benefit them regardless. It'd still be made in America, whether if it's a service or not, which you're starting to do, as you're probably aware of. Like they have the adult part now in the theme parks where now they're offering, wine and beer, right? It's like, well, yep. And then you think about when it comes to restaurants, where companies make the most money is as an off-day alcohol. So I think that was a smart move. So, I'm just saying that there's other opportunities that you're not thinking of that actually could drive revenue as well and still have things, more made in America, more associated with that.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, then as companies develop their brand equity and brand value, everything that we've talked about so far, let's use Nike as another example. Some people don't have the marketing dollars that a Nike may have. So do you have to look at it differently from, let's say, a startup or based on a mid-sized company? Maybe like we talked about before. Okay, let's just assume someone has a brand at this point. I'm sure there's a money constraint on a lot of this stuff. How do people get around that?
Well, how they get around it is that you still need a strong position of your brand. Otherwise, your marketing, regardless of what you do, would be, unfortunately, a waste of money and a waste of time. Because now what exactly you're promoting? You're promoting, like a lot of times when I see companies promote small companies, mid-sized companies, and large companies, they're not really promoting the positioning of the brand because they haven't got clarity around that. So the first thing, regardless of the size of the company, is getting clarity of your positioning. And then it's really understanding who your target market is and then what media do they use. A lot of times I see these younger companies, that are advertising or using marketing for their generation when we're actually really should be advertising to the generation above them, which is the baby boomers, which they absorb media differently and have access and use media differently. So it's really being smart and thinking about how you plan to reach your target market and what is a best appropriate media. And then you really want to be thinking of two things, organic and strategically position yourself where you're actually then buying media. And a buying media could be pretty minimum, quite honestly. It could be like you're a sponsor to, let's say, a stage event, a big event that's live now that we're opening up with COVID and stuff being gone, or let's say at the wayside. We're
right.
then looking at opportunities where small companies could be a sponsor and get some recognition on stage or through a program that they wouldn't have necessarily before to their target market. So there's a lot of smart ways to utilizing your budget. Is understanding, again, what would be the priority and what would be the best way to reach your target market with the biggest bang for your buck.
Got it. And what if somebody comes to you and they say to you, okay, Howard, I'm at point A. I've developed my brand at this point. We're at point A. We want to go to, let's say, point B or whatever, and they say to you, what should we do? What are your suggestions? And then you give them some suggestions, et cetera. Do they listen to you? Because I find a lot of these guys very stubborn.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I always start with an online assessment that we do. We do a business and branding online assessment, and I review their website. I review their, let's say they have a pitch deck. I review, whatever they're creating, I review. Whatever they're using to really interface between them and their target audience and gaining more traction in the marketplace. And generally speaking, there's this huge gap, regardless of the size of company, whether you're a startup or even in the $1 billion. There's usually this big gap of what they say who they are and what they're actually saying who they are on their website, and then actually how they're positioning themselves. Like, let's say 10 being best, 1 being the worst. Most companies sit between a 2 and a 4, and then it's about bridging that gap. How do you build so you actually are saying the right thing to your target market? So I always start with an assessment, no matter what size company a company is. And then what smart ones do listen. The smart ones show me what they've done, and they tell me what the results have been, whether if it's like profit, revenue, equity, getting more customers, getting a deeper reach in the marketplace. So I do get quote unquote case studies of doing these assessments where companies tell me through testimonials of how a difference it did make. Yes, and you're right. There are people that they love the information, the whole thing's recorded, and they don't take any action.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, they won't get very far, but that's how they're kind of like moving their business across the chessboard, is that they are just moving it forward, but they're not really taking advantage of not just me, but other experts in the field.
Yeah, and it would seem to me that as people develop their brand equity, that kind of shoots up exponentially relatively quickly, but then it's got to level off a little bit, and then they have to come up with something different to take it from the next step. Is that a good assessment? Does that happen?
Yeah, it's really again looking for a big vision, like what legacy you're going to leave behind, which could go out 200 to 300, 400 years out. So that really becomes a huge driving force, and then the philosophy, like why do you do what you do? So those become where they're not so much a milestone because they take lifetimes to obtain or generations to obtain. But that's a good thing, because once you, like a difference between a mission statement and a vision statement is a vision statement is more like an ongoing statement, like the difference it's making across the globe. What is the ripple effect? A mission statement is like a business mission. Where are your goals? Where do you want to have your KPIs? Where do you want you to have your goals met? And you're right. Once you meet those goals, and if it was only a company based on a mission statement, then once they reach those goals, they're kind of like stuck. They reached their lid. They reached the pinnacle point, and then they kind of have to start over again. But if companies, when they have a vision, a philosophy, yes, there are milestones in place, but you're very clear, like where you want to be, 50, 100, 200 years out. So you just keep evolving based on that plan. And that's why strategy matters first, where you got to be really strategic. So therefore, you are taking a straight line as far as you possibly can, and then of course you're putting in these corrections, but at least it's getting you where you want to go faster, and also at the same time, it's more of a streamlined approach that pulls everyone forward.
Yeah, and then if you do it correctly.
This is why Ron and I do this podcast, Howard, because a lot of businesses don't realize what you just were explaining. They think in terms of today, and they create a vision, they have a mission, this is what they want to do, but they're right now, right here, and that's it. And we try to bring as much information to people, our listeners. Like you said, you have to have your strategy, and your strategy is, I'm going to do this and this and this, but you have to anticipate as many ripples out that you can, so that you can be prepared, so that you know that you have to do some branding, you know that you have to do marketing, you know that you have to understand your customer, and that each legal thing is not creating your entity, but it also involves things that are relative to marketing, to branding, to what you're producing. And it's a big thing, and you need to have people to help you to understand that it's more than creating an idea or having a product and now everything's going to happen magically as soon as I start telling people about it. It doesn't work that way. And you have to strategy is thinking out as many ripples as you can, and then being able to adapt to what you didn't think of.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the strategy is usually what's missing in most companies, and so you're right.
Exactly.
It's like they almost become like a one-hit wonder. They might do something right, through dumb luck or through timing or whatever it may be, which is great, but then it's not sustainable. You got to look at, thinking out how technology, where people are moving, what society's doing, how the younger generation's thinking. It's really understanding anthropology, sociology. It's understanding technology and hedging into the future, and then designing products as far as fulfilling a particular need that maybe most times the consumers don't even know that they need. And that just takes a lot more vision and a lot more critical thinking. If you start doing things, here and now, well, guess what? 1 million other companies are doing that, and it's going to be short-lived.
And then you wonder how come it didn't work, even though it was a fabulous idea.
Yeah, exactly. You got to have the foresight, and then you got to have the integrator to integrate it into reality.
And then when you do all this correctly, you're looking at hundreds or thousands or however many customers that you have in your business, and they're all happy, and they're all promoting your business to other people, and they become your evangelists. How about that for a 1,000-person sales force without having to pay them? And I think that's a really huge part of equity. And once you get to that point, boy, Howard, you got to be pretty successful, right?
No, I agree with you. I got clients that exactly right. We're really utilizing specifically Amazon for their product and getting authentic, not like real organic, authentic testimonials, 5-star reviews, and that's what's really perpetuating the sales. But it was getting the right strategy in place to make sure that we were going to be able to get the response that we want based on price point and the value of the quality of the product, and then marrying those two. And then now we're looking at all these new channels, because once you master one channel, we're like, well, what about retail? What about QVC, HSN? What about if we did things in addition with strategic partners and actually had JVs? So yeah, you want to master. In my opinion, when I work with clients, let's think big, start small, but then master at least one of the channels. And then when you master one of the channels of sales, then you look at what are the other sales channels that actually make a lot of sense that may not require all that much more work. It's just a matter of tuning up the model to have enough flexibility to be able to pivot down another revenue stream, another channel. And we've had much success with that.
Excellent point. That's great. So listen, before we close this out, Howard, why don't you tell everyone out there how they can get a hold of you if they want to maybe set up a consultation with you? And I'm sure you'll be honest and poke holes and tell them it's a good idea or a bad idea or whatever, right?
Oh yeah. No, I do it in a nice way, but I do it where they become aware of what they didn't know, and then with that, they will prosper further, because it's taken literally 35 years of my experience of building many multi-million-dollar businesses. But it's like looking at their blind spots, and then looking at also and telling them what they didn't know about their business. So so the way people could reach me is as simple as going to my website at howcreative.com, and then there's an actual want to get a hold of me form up there, and they fill out the form, and then we arrange a 10-minute introduction call to get an idea of what their needs and desires and what they're looking for.
All right.
Excellent.
That sounds great. Well, we'll tell you, we were talking about rating before. If I had to rate this podcast, I'd rate the podcast high, but I would rate the windstorm that we're experiencing right now a 1, which we do not recommend. So
not good, Randy.
I've been in Vegas a couple of times where the wind has been like I had no idea how strong of a wind can get.
And it does get strong here sometimes. Yeah, it does.
So Vicki, why don't you close this podcast out? What do you think about the podcast today? What are your comments?
It's great. It was great. It really was great, Ron. People forget that businesses have equity and assets that aren't always measured by how much money you have in the bank. But equally important is the emotional connection that you create with your customers, as well as your relationship building, and doing this through branding and marketing. That's what leads to success. And if the listeners today, if they want their businesses to be successful, not only today, but well into the future down the road, then it's very vitally important you contact Howard. Go through his demo. Let him help you, show you, and become successful. And it's okay. Not everybody knows everything, and everybody can use some help. And Howard is the one to do it if you want your business to be a success. And that's all I have to say today.
Wow, okay. No, that's a good way to close it. Howard, thank you so much for taking the time out today on the podcast. Really appreciate your thoughts and your insights, and you're always welcome whenever we want to do another one. I hope we do another one with you soon. So thanks again for your time.
Yeah, thank you, the two of you, for having me back. I love it. Thank you.
Yep.
And we look forward to it, Ron.
And Vicki, thanks for co-hosting this episode. Folks, you're listening to the Mappable USA podcast at MappableUSA.com. If you go to that website, you scroll down, you'll see all our syndication sources. Just pick the one you like best. Subscribe, and you'll never miss another one of our episodes. If you want to be a guest on the show, like Howard was today, there's a guest tab. Fill that out. We'll see what we can do about getting you on the show. And if you like what you heard today, send us an email at info@MappableUSA.com, or just leave a comment on whatever page you're listening to this on right now. So thanks for your support. Thanks for listening. We'll be at you next time with another Laughable USA podcast. Have a great week, everyone.